Okay, so you're used to learning music like this. And you're interested in music that sounds more like this. This was my story. So I started with classical lessons at a pretty young age. And then in my early teen years, I got really interested in jazz and other kinds of improvised music. This is also the story for a lot of students who find me on YouTube, that you're used to reading sheet music, maybe you studied classical music at some point, and whether or not you specifically want to learn jazz, you're interested in improvisation and learning a more independent, free, creative way to play music. You may be discovering the same thing I discovered when I first made this transition, that there's a real difference between how you approach these kinds of music. And part of that is that they're coming from very different musical traditions. So I want to give you my best advice on the deep underlying differences between these musical traditions, classical music and jazz, and then how they're going to impact your learning. It's going to require you to listen differently, to practice differently, and then you're going to want to expect to improve differently. All right, first, what do I mean by listen differently? For this, it helps to understand that we're talking about two very different musical traditions. And classical music can refer to a lot of different things, so can jazz. So I'll put things more concretely in terms of the music that I was learning when I was growing up. When I was learning classical music, it was with a local piano teacher, beloved in the neighborhood. And she taught more or less out of the Oregon Music Teachers Association curriculum. So I was learning solo piano pieces by European male composers from the 17th to early 20th century. So I was learning music by Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, some Rachmaninoff. And that music is all coming out of Europe. Basically, nothing that I played with that teacher was written in the last century. And that is actually the musical tradition where the piano was invented. The piano was invented in Europe, and also the tradition of sheet music, writing down music and learning music from sheet music, was invented in Europe. So that's how I started, studying with a classical music teacher where that was the approach. I would learn my pieces from the sheet music with her help, and I was learning pieces typically written more than 100 years in the past. When I got interested in learning jazz, I was really attracted to jazz pianists like Vince Guaraldi, who wrote the Peanuts music, the Charlie Brown Christmas music. You might recognize. Right, and then I got a little bit deeper into it, and I fell in love with Oscar Peterson's playing. And these are musicians who are coming out of an American musical tradition, specifically an African-American musical tradition, mostly developed in the 20th century, right? The 1900s. And it's much more of an oral music tradition, meaning that you learn by listening. Most of the important things about this music were not written down. So it requires you to learn in a different way. As I started to study with good jazz teachers, they would recommend to me that a big part of how I practiced should just be listening to records, exploring the history of the music, and starting to develop my own taste about what I liked in improvised music. This just makes it really different from learning classical music. And especially if you're starting to learn jazz and you're switching over from classical music, a lot of students, especially adult students, are tempted to solve this new puzzle of how to improvise by looking for great written resources. And there are a lot out there. You can get great theory books. You can get transcriptions of famous jazz recordings that other people have written out for you. But if you try to only learn jazz or any form of improvised music by looking at written resources, and you don't rely heavily on your ear and listening to the music, both recorded music and live when you can hear it, you're always going to be missing something. And it's partly because of the nature of these different musical traditions and what they value in the music. And it also has to do with the skills that you're trying to learn. So let me break that down. I think the two most important things are rhythm and the importance of ear training. So to speak to rhythm, jazz musicians think about rhythm in a totally different way than classical musicians. And for most jazz musicians, somebody's time, their rhythmic feel, is the most important quality of their musicianship. It's really fun to play with people who have a great time. And we listen for that often before we're listening to some of these other things that might really, really matter to classical musicians. And it's just a different way of thinking about rhythm, because when you're playing jazz, especially like the tradition of swing music, there's this delicate tension that gets created between the different instruments of a rhythm section. And it's not really something you can write down. It's something that you have to learn by listening and experiencing. And because it's this sort of groove-based music that doesn't always adhere to a more mathematical rhythmic grid that you could write out using sheet music, it can be kind of tricky for people who are coming from classical music to wrap their heads around at first. And that was true for me. It took me a long time to feel like I had any real understanding of how to swing. And if you're learning jazz and you're interested in like more traditional jazz music, learning how to swing is a huge part of what you're trying to do. So rhythm is the first part of why listening is such an important part of learning this music in a different way than it is with classical music. And then the second part is that when you're learning to improvise, you are mostly training your ear, because the goal that you're working towards is to be able to imagine things in your mind's ear and then to make them happen on your instrument. So part of that is associating sounds that you come up with the notes that are going to create those sounds. But another part of that is kind of training your imagination. You need to learn to have good taste and good ideas that's going to fit well within the style of a piece of music. So for that, listening really deeply to records and then working closely with them by doing things like transcribing them and integrating transcriptions into your own playing, those things are essential for learning to have a better aural imagination, basically, and also just to get a better ear. So this is why I don't often recommend to people that they only rely on like transcription books. You can get books where somebody has like written out every Charlie Parker solo, for example, and that can be interesting to look at. But so much of the value in writing out a Charlie Parker solo yourself by ear is the fact that it's going to be training your ear. Spending so much time with a solo that you like does a lot to train your ear. And ear training is essential when you're the person coming up with the notes that you're going to play in a different way than it is for classical musicians. Ear training matters a lot for classical musicians too. But if you're just playing solo piano classical music, you don't necessarily need a great ear in order to be able to play all the right notes of the piece. So those two elements, rhythm and ear training, make listening important when you're learning jazz music in a very different way than it is when you're learning classical music. Okay, so you're listening differently. You're treating listening with a different level of importance in jazz compared to learning classical music. This is part of a bigger conversation of how you're going to practice differently. I do have another video that's just dedicated to this topic called How to Learn Jazz Piano, where I talk about kind of 5 broad categories of practice that you want to focus on. But we can touch on these categories here and how they're different from learning classical music. We already mentioned listening. I would say that that's one of your most important categories of practice. Kind of a deeper, even more applied version of listening is something we've already mentioned, transcribing. That means you're figuring out every single note that you hear on a recording that you like, often from a solo that you really like by a great improviser. You can write all those notes down, learn to play them just like the record, and then The really valuable part comes when you start to work with the solo. You put it in different keys. You take your favorite parts of the solo and figure out how to use them in your own improvisations on different standards. So that's developing your vocabulary. We would call that category of practice, that kind of transcribing things and then working them into your own playing. Learning standards is also really important. It means, first of all, that you'll be able to play with other jazz musicians in like a pickup situation, like a jam session. And it also just teaches you a lot about the music. You know, if you want to play one jazz standard better, it helps to learn 100 jazz standards that use a lot of the same harmonic language. It'll make you a lot more comfortable on any given standard. That's a little bit of a hint of the final topic we're going to talk about, which is how you can expect to improve differently when you're learning jazz. So you're going to want to listen, transcribe, learn songs, also just improvise. And this is one of the really big differences from practicing classical music. You have to just make a mess. Like, I think for me, as someone who started on classical music, and for most of my students who are not yet used to improvising, this is the hardest thing psychologically. You can't really get better at improvising without improvising. And it's just going to sound wrong a lot of the time when you start out. You have to kind of learn to embrace that and enjoy it. And you will get better over time if you put yourself in that situation where you're having to come up with things on the fly within some sort of musical framework. You want to do that kind of improvisation alone and also with other people. That's where you'll really learn a lot. And then finally, applied theory is useful. So learning music theory and then especially learning how to find those kind of theory rudiments quickly on your instrument is really valuable. I tend to think that for learning jazz, especially, academia often overemphasizes the importance of theory, but it is really, really helpful. Especially, learning some kind of foundation of music theory where at least you're really comfortable with all your key signatures, all of your chord qualities, and you've practiced kind of some arranging skills. Those things make it a lot easier to learn by ear. And I've already impressed upon you how important learning by ear is. So that kind of foothold of like having the foundation of applied theory skills so that then you can learn this music by ear, that's often the first step that adult students focus on so that then they can learn in this more independent way. And that's also what I tend to really focus on as a teacher. And if you want to learn more about learning those kind of applied theory skills with me, you should go to pianofluency.com. You can become a member. When you're practicing jazz and you're learning to improvise, you're going to want to do some combination of all of these things. And you may be getting a sense it's a little bit messier in general than how it feels to learn one piece of classical music from the sheet music with the help of a teacher. It can feel like you're kind of wandering around in the woods when you're learning to play jazz. And it's because you're developing your own voice as a composer who can compose music on the fly in real time. It's a big challenge. So this speaks to the final area I want to talk about. You need to expect to improve in a different way when you're learning jazz. We might say that when you learn to improvise, all you can really do is raise your floor of ability level. Whereas when you're learning classical music, you have the opportunity to kind of raise your ceiling sometimes. It's very common, especially for younger students of classical music, to have a few pieces that they can play really, really well. And maybe this is your experience. If you've mostly been learning so far not improvised music from sheet music, you probably have a few things that you love to play, you're really comfortable with. But outside of that, you can't really do anything at the instrument. And it's the opposite with jazz. And I found this very frustrating in the early years of learning to play jazz, that it doesn't really matter how much you practice on one single piece. Because every time you play a solo, every time you improvise, even if it's just like improvising the chords that you play behind another musician, it's going to be different every time. That's the whole point, right? You're improvising. And so it can kind of feel like you're not getting anywhere, because it just takes a long time to raise your basic ability as an improviser so that when you come up with a new solo, it sounds good. It's like that saying, wherever you go, there you are. That's really true with improvised music. Any piece that you play, when it comes time to improvise, you're mostly just drawing on your existing bank of improvisational ability. It's like whoever you are as a musician in its totality, that is going to come out when you go to improvise. And it can help a little bit to really focus on the challenges of one particular piece, but mostly you're just going to sound kind of mediocre with every solo that you play and every standard that you play for a long time until, and this is the good news, the flip side of that, once you start sounding pretty good, you're going to sound pretty good with every solo that you play and every piece that you play. And there's kind of an endless, unlimited supply of new solos that you can play over the standards that you know. And you have access to this new music making experience where you get to be really present in the moment and using your imagination in that way, which feels really different from playing a piece that was through composed by another person. You can definitely be very expressive and be in the moment when you're playing a through composed piece of music, but it's really satisfying to improvise, especially with other people, and it gives you this sense of freedom that you can't really get in any other way. So that's the good news. The experience of learning jazz or learning any kind of improvised music is basically that you have to be really patient, especially, if you're holding yourself to the standard of these great recordings that you're listening to help you learn. You're really not going to sound anything like that for a long time. But as you improve, every little bit of improvement that you make to your general ability as an improviser is going to carry across to pretty much everything that you play. So that's the fun part. To use another analogy for it, it's like, if you're learning one-off difficult pieces of classical music that you have to kind of maintain, and then they may fade away and you learn another hard piece of classical music and you're gradually building up your ability. But with classical music, it's like you are sending scouting missions with your cavalry. I'm making a military metaphor. And if you're learning jazz, you're just like an advancing army. It's like there's nobody there until suddenly, like, it's just overwhelming. And you can improvise whatever you want on any standard that you know. So as you can see, because these are two very different musical traditions, and there are different values in the music and they ask for different things from the performer, you really have to approach learning jazz in a different way. You're going to listen differently, practice differently, and improve differently. And it's helpful to understand the mindset of jazz musicians, even if you don't specifically want to become a great jazz musician. If you just want to learn some style of popular music that involves a little bit of improvisation, which pretty much every genre of music does to some degree, it's helpful to understand these things, that like listening, really focusing on rhythm, training your ear, these things are really helpful, and they don't really come up if you're just learning from sheet music. So regardless of the style of music that you personally are most interested in, I hope this overview has been helpful to you. It's really just rooted in my own experience of starting on classical music and switching to jazz. So other jazz musicians out there watching, you may have your own opinions about the big differences here, and I would love to hear about them. And if you are a student who's currently in this process of switching from only learning using sheet music or learning classical music to beginning to improvise, I'd also love to hear from you about how it's going so far, and if there was anything in this video that you found particularly helpful. This was a looser, longer lecture style video than most of my videos, but if you want to go deeper into any of those kind of applied theory topics I was referring to, or if you want to watch my other videos that discuss learning jazz or learning arranging, you should subscribe to my channel here on YouTube, and you can always go to pianofluency.com to learn more about how I can help you grow at the piano. And with that, I want to thank you for joining me. My name is Ted with Piano Fluency.